Hi, I'm Sanjeev Linkaya from Reframing Race.
Hi, I'm Nina Kelly from Reframing Race. So Sanjeev, let's talk public thinking. Um, you're going to take the bit about what public thinking is versus public opinion, very important distinction. But before we get to that and get to our really in-depth research on what the public thinks about race and racism, I just wanted to tell a bit of a story about why it's important, which goes back to my days as a kind of comms officer, so a kind of early entry level job at the Runnymede Trust in 2009, when one of my objectives was to raise the profile generally of the organisation. So Runnymede Trust, race quality think tank, and measure of success would be column inches, kind of broadcast minutes that covered the messages that we were putting out. So if a press release that we put out was covered in the newspaper in the way that we had presented it, that looked like success, right? And the more, the better. But I was always really interested in the piece after that, which was, were we changing anybody's mind? Like, how was it actually landing with the general public when they saw these headlines that came from our research? What were they imbibing? What did they think about that? And I think, looking back on it now, part of the reason that I was confronted with that question was the advent of Twitter. It was the advent of social media. So I set up the Runnymede Twitter account in 2009, unbeknownst to the very kind of academic sort of research backgroundy leadership, who were not interested at all in Twitter, and had told me that it just kind of wasn't for them and it sounded like nonsense, which told me that they weren't on Twitter, so I could just set it up, and no one would know. And I tell that story to basically say that I was on Twitter as Runnymede Trust, kind of on my own for a while, and getting all this feedback, as you do, back in the days when the algorithm wasn't a complete echo chamber. You were just hearing from the general public about what you were putting out. And we'd put out, for example, all I really tweeted were our press releases. And a headline might be, Black men in London stopped and searched at 9 times the rate of their white counterparts, right? That might be a headline we put out, a piece of research, a fact. And we would think internally in the Runnymede office and as race equity advocates, that there you go, kind of proof positive of institutional racism in our criminal justice system. That's what we thought. I knew, because of Twitter, that that was not what people were receiving. That wasn't what everybody thought. That's not how everybody interpreted that statistic. They would get the same fact and hear something else. And what they would hear, that I was learning, was a kind of version of biological racism. They were hearing that Black men were more likely to be criminals, and that was something kind of related potentially to their race or to them being Black. And I just realized through that process that actually there are these underlying beliefs, clearly, that are held by the public, which, we, providing information as we were, weren't doing a lot to unpick. And I was fascinated right back in 2009 about what that public thinking looked like and what it might be. And then a long time later, along came you, with this public thinking idea of reframing race. How do we kind of capture that? So yeah, I want to hand over to you to tell our audience about what we mean by public thinking and what we found out.
Thanks, Nina. I'm slightly worried. Are you doing lots of stealthy things for Reframing Race without telling me as well, given your track record? But public thinking versus public opinion. So that's a really important piece. What we're most interested in looking at is what is going on deep down when people think about ideas about race, racism, anti-racism, and anti-racist future. And what you do get is quite a lot of public opinion research, a bit of polling on something that might be a bit current. And people will say that they like an idea, they don't like an idea, they like a policy, they don't like a policy. But if you're really to do deep communications that really kind of moves minds, moves hearts, what you really want to understand is the depth of feeling and thinking that people are kind of holding in their heads and their hearts. So public thinking research is much more about, oh, what do people hold in their heads when they see racial disparities? What kind of story are they telling themselves about why that might be? Do they think race is a real idea, tells you something about someone's kind of character, about their intelligence, and so on, or do they think, like they should think, that it's a made-up concept that is an enabler of racism? So that's why we're trying to get to public thinking. And in our research, we do kind of a battery of questions that kind of get at different aspects of public thinking. And that's really helpful for us because in the end, if we're to make long lasting change, call people to our cause, it's the hearts and minds stuff that we have to move decisively. So that's a distinction there. Just to say a little bit more, so there were two really in-depth studies, although we've done kind of background research as well, desk research. So one is a qualitative piece of research that we commissioned ICM to do, and that's what in the jargon is called about culture models. So what story do people tell themselves about race and racism? So that's a small scale qualitative piece of research. And that in turn, along with our engagements with our advocates, informed how we did our quantitative research to 20,000 people, England and Scotland, representative of the population of those nations as a whole. And what we that allowed us to understand at scale how the public think and feel about race, racism, and so on. I will say, just on that 20,000 person study, so we filtered out the extremes. So we got rid of anyone who is kind of a hardcore racist, because actually we're not really going to learn very much from engaging with them. And we filtered out people like me and you, so who are the hardcore kind of anti-racist, because again, you know, we're both at both ends, we're set in our ways, and so we wouldn't have learned much. So the kinds of people we were accessing were the people that are in every room. So that's just a little bit of setup there.
Yeah, and then thinking about what we learned, because this is the fascinating thing. Obviously, you mentioned the two pieces of research, and there were two reports, of course, Common Ground, Contested Space for the first one, and then Testing Time, so people can go and have a look. These are all freely available on our website, reframingrace.org. But with Testing Times, what we wanted to look at were kind of messages that move. So language that might persuade people better than the language that I talk about using, you know, decade or more ago at the Runnymede Trust. Like, how might we persuade people, bring people more powerfully to our cause? But of course, what we also found out, which is what this kind of little session is about, rather than the messages, which we'll talk about in another session, was that kind of like baseline public thinking. So we found out, particularly because we're speaking to such an enormous number of people, or Savannah Comrades was on our behalf, what is it that people think already about race and racism, you know, before we get to what might change the way they could think? What are they holding? And we've actually got a lot of fascinating research around that. So yeah, maybe if you want to highlight a couple of statistics.
Yeah, and this stuff is really fascinating. So again, for the geeks among our listeners and viewers, so this is the control group. So we didn't hit them with any messages. So we just want to think to understand what they think and feel. So what we learn is that people are a bundle of contradictions. So we use this image of Janus, so Janus, if you're interested in Googling. So this, if you're not up on your kind of Roman mythology, so Janus is the Roman god of beginnings and endings. So has one face that way and one face that way. And it's because some of the ideas around kind of race and racism are very backward looking, like old school racism, and other aspects are quite forward looking, so much more humane and understanding how race is a kind of made up idea. So some of the contradictions. So we have 40% of people in England and in Scotland think that some ethnic groups are naturally harder working than others. Something about how you look here affects what you are, your capacity for work, which of course is nonsense. We know that. At the same time, you have more forward-looking. 94% think that everyone in our society, regardless of race or ethnicity, has a shared humanity and should be treated with dignity. So that's 40 plus 94. That's, like we're in the 130s there. So a lot of people are holding both of those ideas at the same time, even though they are contradictory. So as a society, we might be quite divided, but actually, as on an individual level, we're also quite confused around this idea. Another example of this contradiction. So we ask people when they see um, outcomes where Black and minoritized ethnic people experience worse outcomes than their white counterparts. How do they account for this? So one example, backward looking, is 50%, 57% say it's because of defeatist attitudes of some Black and minoritized ethnic people. So this idea that, we've heard that there's racism in the world, so we've just basically given up. Clearly nonsense, but and then on the other side, you've got 63% saying that it's because of racist discrimination against Black and minoritized ethnic people. So again, 57 plus 63, so 120%. So like that can't happen. So again, you have people pulled in different ways about accounting for racial disparities. And so that's a jumble of contradiction. Where that's interesting is that people holding competing ideas, and some of the ideas can kind of maybe like kind of lift up and come forward, and in some ways that we're calling out to people's better selves, their more humane kind of aspects, and calling to that sense of shared humanity.
Yeah, that duality kind of highlights opportunities, doesn't it? When you think about what do you want to tap into? So what are the shared values, or what are people thinking that is already moving them in a positive kind of more solutions focused way that you, as the anti-racist advocate, can use in your language and your thinking and the values that you evoke with your framing to move further and maybe move further away from some of the other stuff. But to reflect on that just for a moment, because I think it's important to, in some ways, those statistics are not going to be a surprise to a lot of people kind of watching and listening to this who already know about racism, know about anti-racism, and know that these beliefs are kind of widespread, or at least they feel it, in the racism that shows up in our society. But 40% of people essentially holding on to a fundamentally completely debunked nonsense idea of biological racism. That is a lot of people, that's a lot of us, I should say. It's not, and broken down, we should say, by ethnicity and so on. It's not that just white people are thinking this, it's people that are thinking this, so it's in every room. It's in every classroom, and it's in every boardroom, and it's in, well, maybe not classroom, actually, I don't know, children should be exempt from this, really. But the idea is there in everywhere you kind of step into. And along with that kind of 40% of people thinking that, race tells you something about their character, someone's character, or that some people are harder working than others. There's, I think it was 19% or close to 20% of people in England agreed that some races or ethnicities were more intelligent or less intelligent than others, which is that really kind of like deep biological racism. And that's still a huge figure, that's 1 in 5, isn't it? So again,
Yeah.
if you're in a room with more than 5 adults, chances that that's in the room, so it's in institutions. And I think it's just worth validating that for a moment, that kind of sense that if you feel like there is institutional racism at play, it's probably because this kind of persists across all of our thinking and all of our institutions. And, there's a reality there about the quite hostile ground that any anti-racist message is likely to land on. And how do we think about kind of working with that?
And just to say, obviously, because we've had the Genome Project, we know that a lot of those all of those ideas are meaningless. But also, as all of us who've been doing advocacy work on anti-racism, race equity, racial justice for a long time know, that although people should know better, that isn't, we can't take that for granted.
Absolutely. So I think we'll leave it there. We'll talk about the messages that move in our next session. If you listening and watching found this content useful, follow us on LinkedIn or sign up for our newsletter at reframingrace.org. Thank you for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.